guys, it's Sam, and this is my review of The Two Lives of Lydia Bird by Josie Silver. So the first part of this review will be spoiler-free, and then I have a small section at the end that I will talk about some of these spoilers and things about the plot, so I will warn you before that happens, but it wasn't really enough to split into two videos, so that's why I'll be doing it at the end. So this is a adult contemporary story that follows our main character of Lydia, and at the very beginning of the book, her fiancé Freddie, who she's been with since basically being a teenager, has passed away in a car accident. And so we are following her throughout her grief process, about about 2.5 years, maybe 2 years. And during this time, she actually starts taking sleeping pills, and when she's on the sleeping pills, and I'll explain this in a second because this sounds kind of sketchy, when she's on the sleeping pills, she actually goes to like an alternate universe where Freddie is still alive. So she almost is living two lives, where there's this alternate reality where Freddie is still alive, and then her current life where she is mourning his loss. So I was really drawn to this story because, one, I loved One Day in December by Josie Silver, which was a book that I think is fairly polarizing. I've done a review for, but is one of my favorite romance books, and is very like raw and not for everyone. And so this I was very excited about as well, and I feel like this has some similar elements as far as being probably pretty polarizing, like this is not going to be for everybody. Also, I really like grief stories. Like P.S. I Love You is one of my favorite like rom-com dramedies ever. I just really dig these kinds of like someone young loses their loved one, which is like really morbid, but I'm really drawn to those stories for some reason. So I was into this from the get-go. So let's get into it. From the very beginning, I was like immediately crying. I teared up, like my eyes pricked like multiple times throughout this story. And it's not that this is like, oh my god, I mean, it's sad, obviously, like someone loses their fiance and like is dealing with grief, like it's gonna be sad, but just the way that Josie Silver writes and like the rawness and the way that she just like scrapes my soul with emotion, it's something very unique to her, which is why I really like her stories. So from the get-go, I kind of just like felt it. She has a really good way of depicting, very similar, I'm gonna make a lot of comparisons to P.S. I Love You, even though those are very different stories. Sort of like the beginning of P.S. I Love You, where you see those two characters and you like get how much they love each other. She also does this very quickly within this book, so you understand Lydia and her fiance Freddie's relationship very quickly and like feel for that loss. So as far as the speculative element of her taking the sleeping pills and falling asleep and like being with Freddie in dreamland, I actually really liked this element because it's never fully explained. So at the very end, she does kind of mention like, I don't know if I was really in an alternate reality or if this was just like my own imagination or like a grief process. And I like that it's just kind of left as like, it is what it is, because I think if you put too much focus on this, it falls apart. What I also really liked is that, and I don't really consider this a spoiler, it's never touched on with other characters. She never brings it up to other characters. I find that when there's a speculative element put into a like contemporary or a contemporary romance, that you can have to like tread kind of carefully. I've read a couple of like time loop stories recently that people live in like a Groundhog Day, which is another kind of speculative element that is thrown into contemporary stories sometimes. And usually those characters end up like confessing this to somebody and saying this is what's happening, and of course like everyone's like, you're crazy, and no one believes them. So her never really telling anyone about this and it just being like part of her grief process, I feel like makes it better. It makes it so it's like we never really have to like come to terms with that, and also it makes like the sleeping pill thing a little bit better for me. Just, I'm gonna say a swallow, which is like a funny pun almost, because I think there could be some weird like, oh, is taking pills bad narrative, and it's never seen that way here. Like this, it's just kind of like a mechanism for her grieving process in whatever way that ends up happening. I end up liking how she dealt with that. So as far as like the characters and things, I loved this depiction of grief. Again, I like grief stories for a number of reasons. I always have. I've worked in like the death and dying sort of sphere before, so I just really like seeing these kinds of things, and this I think was like a very realistic, raw depiction of grief. I really liked Lydia. I pulled for her. I found her to be very, like I said, realistic, because really every grief depiction is realistic. People grieve differently, and people grieve in like very sort of like understandable ways for others and grieve in very like extreme ways for others. The whole point is that grief is not for anyone else but the person experiencing that grief. So she does some things that could be seen as like selfish, and it all really makes sense within the context of her grief. The other thing I really liked is because we get to see her and Freddie's dynamic as if he didn't die, she does have a lot of commentary in here about how she gets to see the ways in which their life ended up not being perfect, you know, and she misses some things. She's only there when she's sleeping, you know, and she's not there necessarily every day. So she misses some things, but she ultimately starts to see like, oh, if we would have, you know, if he would have survived and we would have been together in my like waking life, things would have not necessarily been perfect, and that when we lose someone, we have a tendency to romanticize them. And this is the opportunity I have to see, like, Freddie wasn't perfect, and maybe we wouldn't have always been happy, and we probably would have stayed together, but like, who knows what would have happened. And so throughout the book, we kind of get to see Freddie being this like perfect idealized self. We're so happy she's back with him and that she gets this moment. We feel for her there, but then also seeing like, oh wow, like they're a very real couple and things were not perfect and he has flaws, and that was all really interesting. I also liked a lot of the side characters. Those characters felt very real. A major character is Jonah Jones, who is Freddie's best friend but was actually Lydia's childhood friend first, so they've kind of always been like a trio, and Jonah was in the car with Freddie when Freddie passed. So there's this whole element, and I love this when like two characters lose someone who was equally important to both of them for different reasons, and they like communicate around that, and I just really like that dynamic. So that's a thing that's in here. And then there's just these other like side characters as far as like some of her coworkers who feel very real, and her family and how her family is trying to like help her through this process and are also having their own lives. So I really liked like all of the characters in here, and they again felt like real people who are existing outside of the story. I will say plot-wise, I loved this book for sure loved it for like the first half, and then towards the like 70% mark, it started to kind of meander, and it did some like weird things, which I'll get into in like the spoiler section. But basically, I thought it was going one direction, and then it kind of goes away from that in a very like pointed way, in the way that the characters kind of describe things. So I'm like, oh, we're not going down that path that I thought we were going down. Okay, so I removed my emotions from the potential for that first path that I thought we were going down. And then at the very end, we end up meandering back to that first path that I originally thought we were going down, but then I'm less invested. So there was like a little bit of that, where I felt like it got a little bit meandering, like lost in the weeds a bit, and could have been tightened up. So with that, that is sort of tied to the romance element of the story. So you probably heard me say at the beginning that this is a contemporary story, because I don't know if you can quite classify this as a romance, because romance has so many specific beats, but it does have some of the romance things in it. It even has like romance stuff a little bit towards the end, but I don't know if I would call this a romance book. Ultimately, it's about Lydia and her grief. So it was very confusing with that, like with what I thought I was getting into, and then what I end up getting, and then what I end up really getting at the end. Like it was just a lot for me. But ultimately, I did really like this, and I think this will stick with me for some time. I end up landing on 3.75 out of 5 stars, but I could see myself over time, like maybe at the end of the year when I'm reviewing all the books that I read, potentially bumping it up a bit to like a 4 star. I don't know, because the depiction of grief in this whole process I really liked, but some of the other elements that I was expecting and things weren't as solid as I expected. Now I'm going to get into the brief spoiler discussion kind of about that meandering thing for those of you that have read it. So if you haven't and you want to check it out, see you later, but otherwise I'm going to talk about some spoilery type stuff. So you probably can tell from what I just said about the meandering bit that I was talking about the whole thing between her and Jonah. And I was very confused by this, because when I first got into the story, I was like, oh my god, this is her like childhood friend. They were friends before, and like they're gonna get together now in Freddie's absence. Not because they would have if he would have been alive, but because they are the two that relate to each other the most with his passing. So I love grief stories when two people who have this common thread, this person who has passed, like kind of start forming a relationship, maybe a closer friendship, or like a romantic relationship. I know some people don't like that and they're very against that, but I, again, as someone who's like used to like the grief space, that is common. That happens like a lot, and it's not a betrayal of that person. It's just like you lost someone that's so important to you, and only this other person can really get it. And like it's not weird, and they don't feel bad for you, and like all that stuff. So yeah, so I really liked the idea of like her and Jonah like getting together. And then like almost halfway through, like they were having a couple instances of seeing each other, you know, like he had done the New Year's thing and then like backed off, and they saw each other at the grave and whatever. And then she gets with I forget what the guy's name is, the like Viking guy. And I was like, oh, she's gonna like, they're just gonna be friends, her and Jonah, she's gonna get with this guy. Okay, cool. I also like that. Like she finds herself with a new person and like all of that. And then that happens, and then he leaves, you know, because they like split, and I was like, oh, okay, so it's not a romance at all? Like that's where then I was like, okay, so I'm just giving up on all hope. Then there's the alternate reality scene where Jonah in that reality confesses that he's always been in love with her. So then I'm waiting for him to do it in this reality, like waking world. And she says in that, she was like, I could never picture him as anything but a friend, da 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 da. And I'm like, I don't, okay. And then like towards the very end, when they start talking when she's traveling, I'm like, but they're just friends, because she keeps uttering these lines of like, he's just my closest friend, I'm so glad our friendship's back, blah blah blah, and there's like no foreshadowing of them getting together. And then at the very, very end, like last 5%, they get together. So like that was the part that kind of threw me. I think if we wouldn't have had this back and forth, I would have been fine, because it was sort of like toying with my emotions, and I was like, okay, it's not gonna happen, I'm not gonna be invested in that anymore. So I kind of would have preferred, if they were gonna go this route, either foreshadow her and Jonah more clearly sooner, or if she gets with the other guy, like maybe even make it so it's like either she fully gets with the other guy, like maybe they reunite later after London or whatever, or her and Jonah just stay like close friends. Like I didn't like this back and forth thing. And even the ending where she was like, when he was talking about his story and she read it and stuff, and she was like, you know, he had said that he's always been in love with her and whatever. I'm like, it still feels a little like, to have it be like he was always in love with her and he couldn't be with her, but then Freddie died, so now he can, and like how do we come to terms with that exactly, because the story didn't explore it enough. Like I'm actually fine with that. Like I think that plot thread is fine if they would have spent some time unpacking it a bit, and they just kind of didn't. And it was just like, you know, he's back in her life, she goes and like sits on the couch with him and they cuddle, and then it's like, let's be together. I just would have liked more. Like if we were gonna do that, I wanted that to be like a full romance book, because again, it does have a romance ending. It has like a happily ever after, they get together, but it didn't have the other romance beat, so that's why it's very hard to kind of know how to classify this. So let me know what your guys' thoughts were that have read it about this whole like mishmash of not really knowing what direction it was going to go in and all of that. I would have liked a more like clear foreshadowed bit about all of that. So yeah, let me know your thoughts. Let me know also if you have any similar books to this. I like these like grief books in this way. I don't know, this gave me just like P.S. I love you vibes, and like that kind of grief book I really dig. So comment below and let me know your thoughts on this book. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.